See the presentation?
Yeah, I can see the MASTS Webinar thing. Yep.
Perfect. Okay. Well, thank you so much for having me today. It's not a fantastic opportunity to reach out to MASTS and you know the global community actually. I've seen that these webinars attract an international audience, and so it's really a fantastic opportunity to talk about our work and the sort of global context. In terms of challenges and opportunities, I think they are both global and unique to Scotland in terms of what can be achieved here, and also some of the challenges we have here. But I fundamentally thought about framing this presentation today around our vision and our vision for the next 10 years. And our vision has always aligned to Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. So really where Project Seagrass sits in that is working towards those goals and working with two vehicles that we've been given by the UN. The first of which is this UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, and the second is this UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. Having those two decades is a really useful tool for reaching out to other organisations who are also working towards the SDGs, and also for framing our work in terms of working in Scotland, but working also on a planetary scale. And I think that global picture is important. As a bit of a background to Project Seagrass, Project Seagrass has really been born out of work that's been conducted in the Indo-Pacific. And in the Indo-Pacific, it's quite clear, or it's very clear, that healthy seagrass meadows provide havens for biodiversity, are huge fisheries powerhouses, and have got direct links to food security for a large number of people. And I think that's something which in the UK and in Scotland is masked to us slightly because of our internationalised supply chains. That perhaps the connection isn't quite as obvious. But coming from that background and the research of my co-founders Richard and Leanne, I think that's something which has always sat with us as an organisation. Is the fact that seagrass meadows globally have different ecosystem services and can be, I guess, essential to daily life in many regions. And I also wanted to start by saying, I think in the UK we've become a little bit synonymous with seagrass restoration, and that is a big part of our work in the UK. But we are a global facing organisation, and we are working still today on international projects. So we're working in the Pacific at the moment in a project which is facilitating scientific method development in East Timor, the Philippines, Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia. And so although the conversation today and the theming today is going to be around the work in Scotland and the rest of the UK, we are a global facing organisation. So to give you a bit of an introduction to us as an organisation, I just thought I'd share with you our mission, vision, value statement. As an organisation, we want to lead societal change to enable the recognition, recovery and resilience of seagrass ecosystems. And that's global. We know that seagrass meadows provide biodiversity. They actually provide a suite of ecosystem services, which I'll go on to talk about, but they're essential in many places for sustainable livelihoods. And as part of nature, they are essential for planetary life support. Across the globe, seagrass ecosystems are recognised to different degrees. And certainly over the last 10 years, I think we've seen an increasing recognition of the importance of seagrass ecosystems in the UK. But we've still got a long way to go, especially if we're going to realise the vision, which is a world in which seagrass meadows are thriving, abundant and well managed for people and planet. I think across the globe, there is various degrees of management regimes out there, which have got various degrees of success. Globally, the picture for seagrass meadows is pretty grim. We're still losing seagrass, although there are hotspots out there where management regimes are in place, which are actually enable seagrasses to thrive and to increase in extent, and that's what we want to work to is more of that, those well-managed systems. And our values. So really, Project Seagrass was created with the intention of converting seagrass research. The four of us who set up Project Seagrass are all marine researchers. We've all come from the academic community. But we wanted to make sure that research was being applied, and then it was actually seeing solid conservation outcomes. And I think the only way that that can be achieved is through communication. So actually raising the profile of seagrass and making the case for seagrass as an ecosystem, but also through working through partnerships. And that's partnerships with academic institutions, with government, with the private sector, public sector, and with the communities in which we work. Fundamentally, the challenges I think we face globally in terms of the biodiversity emergency and climate emergency aren't going to be solved alone, and it really takes collaborative actions and solid partnerships to make the changes over the next 10 years that we need to see. As a quick introduction to the founders, this is the team that set up Project Seagrass. Dr. Leanne Cullen-Unsworth is a senior research fellow at Cardiff University, and she works in a couple of socio-ecological systems, but has a real focus on the sort of social science side, and how seagrass ecosystems affect people and the communities where they're found. Associate Professor Richard Unsworth is at Swansea University. He's a senior lecturer there, and he's also led on the Seagrass Ocean Rescue Restoration work here in the UK. And then Ben Jones is at Stockholm University, and he's currently doing his PhD at sustainable supply chain management of capture fisheries, but looking at the couple of socio-ecological system in East Africa and the Indo-Pacific. So that's the team, and that's a little bit about Project Seagrass. And where we sit in terms of our value systems and how we direct our work are explicitly linked and always have been to the SDGs. I find these useful because they're designed to mean something to everybody. And so in terms of framing what we do, it allows us to think essentially and to consider what we do and how that can potentially be a positive step towards meeting some of the targets set down by the SDGs. So whether that's looking at food security and trying to alleviate poverty, or whether that's about quality education and designing educational resources that can be used to improve ocean literacy and people's understandings of seagrass meadows, whether that's about climate action, informing the debate around blue carbon and making sure that's an evidence-based discussion, or to more obvious elements like life underwater, which would obviously be synonymous with seagrass meadows. So the SDGs are a big part of how we frame our work and what we do. And I know that conversation is pretty strong in Scotland in terms of how the SDGs are being used to frame decision-making moving forward over the next 10 years. As an organisation, though, I think we very much perceive the SDGs in this nested model. And essentially what this nested model is showing is that you need to have a healthy biosphere to have a healthy society, and that you need to have a healthy society and a functioning society to have a functioning economy. Without the biosphere, a functioning biosphere, a healthy biosphere, we're not going to have a healthy and functioning society or a healthy and functioning economy. So really the health of the biosphere underpins all of that. And the SDG, which I think we turn to in terms of our sort of default collaborative mode, is SDG 17. Now, I'm not too sure if you can read that on this diagram, but SDG 17 is about partnerships for the goals. And we're, as an organisation, we're inherently collaborative. We know that fundamentally we're 4 marine biologists who have set up an NGO and who have got aspirations to have positive outcomes for nature. But we don't have all the skill sets and we don't have all the answers. And so, having communities like MASTS and the wider community perhaps on this call, it's nice to be able to collaborate with those individuals, reach out, get inspired by new ideas, and to think outside our sort of marine biology boxes, I guess. So I guess that's a little bit about us. For me, these next 10 years, 2021 to 2030, are going to be a big push for our work. So what for Scotland? Well, the seagrasses in Scotland, there are 2 species. We've got eelgrass, which is the species on the left-hand side. Scientific name is Ostermariner. And this seagrass is found in the subtidal. It tends to be physically larger than Zostranolti or the Warfield grass, and it tends to be found largely subtidally. On a very low tide, it can be exposed. But it tends to be this species that we work mostly with in the UK at the moment, although increasingly we are turning our attention to Zostranolti. Warfield grass on the right-hand side of the screen here is like the name suggests, slightly more diminutive, so it's smaller in stature. It's found higher up in the intertidal. And a lot of the research that has been done in and around Warfield Grass is linked to migratory species, seabirds, species like Brent geese, widgeon, which will forage in Zostera and Altai meadows. But I think the main focus of the conversation today, if I talk about seagrass, is going to be around eelgrass and Zostera marina. It's this species which we have spent most time working with. It's, I say it's found subtidally, so as marine biologists, it's where we spend most of our time. And the sort of ecosystem services that this meadow provides, be that biodiversity, fisheries provision, blue carbon, sediment stabilisation. Those are the conversations we tend to be having when we think about restoration at the moment. Although, like I said, I imagine over the next 10 years we'll be considering restoration of both these types of these species. Biodiversity. So I think one of the biggest things which has always driven us as a group is the biodiversity benefits that are inherent in seagrass meadows. Yes, ecosystem services are broad for seagrass meadows, from ocean acidification buffering to carbon sequestration. But I think fundamentally, if we position this as nature and what the value that nature brings, the biodiversity benefits of seagrass are obvious, I think, to everyone. I was just on this slide here. There's a statement: over 50 species of fish have been recorded in British seagrass meadows, and I think that figure's come from quite a narrow selection of sites. So work has been done in Wales extensively over the past 10 years from the research group between Swansea and Cardiff universities. There's also been some excellent work done on the south coast of England and elsewhere in the UK. But fundamentally, what we're going to see almost certainly is a difference in the faunal ecology of the seagrass, the eelgrass in the Shetland Islands, all the way down to the Channel Islands and Cornwall. So I think, in fact, I have no doubt the number of species of fish that we record in seagrass meadows, when we consider the whole of the UK, is going to be much larger than just from the few study sites that we've considered so far. Now, the seagrass species in the UK might not consist of the green sea turtles and the manatees and the dugongs that are the sort of flagship species from global seagrass meadows, but we do have, like the photo shows, we do have 2 species of seahorse here in the UK, but we also have species like the Atlantic cod, which, speaking from Scotland, perhaps isn't the same food fish or symbolically important food fish that it is in England or Wales, but certainly is a species of commercial importance. And if we know that Atlantic cod use seagrass meadows as a nursery habitat, then we can clearly make the link to more seagrass, more nursery habitat, and potentially more fish for our fisheries. So there's some clear links to be explored here, and some pretty concrete reasons as to why I think expanding seagrass extent around the UK is going to be beneficial for our society. One of the ecosystem services I wanted to touch on today, though, is also blue carbon. In the run-up to COP26, which we're hosting here in Glasgow this year, and we have G7 coming to Cornwall in the not too distant future as well, there's a lot of interest in around blue carbon habitats. The figure that comes from the UN report, which was published last year, is that despite covering only 0.1% of the ocean floor, meadows are highly efficient carbon sinks, storing up to 18% of the world's oceanic carbon. That is true. That's to the best of our knowledge. That's the best of the science who's out there at the moment, but that's from a global perspective. And I just wanted to make the point today to the MASTS community and to the global community listening, that we need to make sure that the conversation around blue carbon and seagrass in the UK is evidence-based. Fundamentally, we're at a very early stage in the UK of getting the data for blue carbon habitats. And whilst the data shows that it is seagrass meadows in the UK are blue carbon habitats, we need to be careful around the figures that are being communicated. There's figures which are being imported from elsewhere in the world, which are not representative of UK seagrass meadows. And so one of our aims as a group is to make sure that we can collect that data, we can coordinate the collection of that data, and that we can share the data which is bespoke for UK seagrasses, rather than using proxy data or data which sometimes comes in from completely different species globally. And I think, just to pause on that thought, I think one of the issues we have as a community globally is not many people had ever heard of seagrass meadows. And so when you then say, well, actually, there's probably about 70 different types of seagrass, and they all physically different sizes and shapes, and they offer different ecosystem services, that's another step beyond, whereas people just think seagrass might just be one thing. That's just like saying trees are one thing. Trees aren't just one thing, and seagrasses aren't just one species either. So, but that's for a future conversation. I just wanted to make that sort of, I guess, position clear on this call. I think one of the reasons why seagrass is also receiving a lot of attention at the moment in terms of potential restoration opportunities in Scotland and across the wider UK is the understanding that actually we've lost a lot of seagrass meadows around the UK. It's not always easy to get some clear data on this because fundamentally historical data for seagrass distribution is inherently poor. There are some areas where data is good, but broadly speaking, the data collection 100 or 200 years ago isn't as accurate as it has been today. And even today, there's work to be done. But just to show you on this slide, that first box there shows the Humber in the 1930s, and it shows the amount of seagrass loss until 2018. In the 1970s, we can see the Essex and Suffolk estuaries here, the amount of seagrass cover, and 2018. And then again, less so down in Cornwall, but in the 1990s to 2018. Alex Green has just, or Dr. Alex Green has, for her PhD, was looking at historical seagrass loss. There's a recent Frontiers publication which looks at the extent of seagrass loss around the UK. And I think we can be pretty confident that we probably lost 50% of our seagrass meadows around the UK, whereas a potential figure could be as high as 92%. But even if you work from the figure of 50%, that's still a lot. And if you think about where those seagrass meadows will have been lost over the past 100 years, it will come as no surprise to you. It will be in those larger estuaries, so the Thames, the Firth of Forth, the Clyde, the Humber, areas where water quality would have taken a huge dip, especially during the process of industrialization and the early 20th century. But actually, that's also a huge opportunity now because water quality, we know, is improving around our estuaries and coasts. For example, here in the Firth of Forth in Edinburgh, it's well documented that water quality is improving. And so whereas seagrass meadows might have been lost in the past, there's actually a good opportunity there to give nature the helping hand to bring these meadows back. And so really restoration provides a means of reversing this loss. Until Seagrass Ocean Rescue, which is the project we ran in Dale from 2019 to 2021, March 2021, there'd been no seagrass restoration at meaningful scale that had ever really been conducted in the UK. Certainly trials had taken place, and there were trials on the south coast of England. We've been trialling various methods in Wales until I moved to Scotland, and the group continues to trial different methods because fundamentally it's not perfect yet, and there's still a long way to go. But what Seagrass Ocean Rescue in Dale represented is a pilot study at scale. Now, 2 hectares isn't a significant, in the global context, restoration project, but what it is it's significantly more than 20 bags or 30 bags, which we were operating on before. Now, we've got a collective vision to establish 2,500 hectares of seagrass in the UK. So this is Oster Mariner. And that's been sort of conceptualized into 3 phases. So phase 1, which was really in preparation for the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, was the 2 hectare pilot site in Dale. And we learned a lot from that. And I think there's still a long way to go. I think globally, the seagrass research community is learning a lot about restoration. But you might think 2 hectares, and then you want to plant 2,500 hectares by 2030. How is that possible? Well, I think fundamentally it's about a culture. It's about a culture of restoration. The UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration is about generation restoration. It's about creating a culture of restoration so that restoration becomes normal and that everyone is aware of the need for restoration and that people are behind it, communities are behind it, and there's an understanding that this is the way forward for nature-based solutions and restoring nature. So we've done phase 1. Phase 2 is where we're at now. And we're looking to at various sites around the UK, where England, Wales, and Scotland. And really, we want to restore. We want to have gone through the restoration process in each of the home nations, because fundamentally, that's how you can catalyze change. Once restoration has been through the system, once the licenses have been applied for, and once everyone's on board with the concept, and also I guess familiar with the concept and understand what the security, biosecurity elements and everything that goes into restoration, they can be confident that this is a method that can be rolled out at scale. And phase 3 is about advocating leadership from outside of our small group of seagrass enthusiasts, to say, actually, it's not just about seagrass restoration, it's about seascape restoration, it's about oyster reefs, it's about blue mussel beds, it's about salt marshes, it's about the terrestrial environment as well, and that land-sea interface. It's about putting nature back. And I think these next 10 years, the 2 decades I spoke about earlier, offer a real opportunity for us to shift the narrative towards one of putting nature back. So, as a quick Seagrass Restoration 101, seagrass is a flowering plant. So these flowers might not look like much, but they are flowers. And I think the nice thing about seagrass as a sort of gateway species for restoration is it is a plant, so it's quite intuitive. All we're looking to do is to take a plant, we're looking to pollinate the plant and for seeds to be produced. We collect the seeds, we germinate those seeds, and they produce more plants. And so in a way which is probably a little bit more accessible than bivalve reproduction, planting seeds and planting hope, as we phrased it, I think is something that people can really engage with in a relatively easy manner. But scale is key. One of the things that we learned when we were trialing all the different methods for seagrass restoration is when you're planting 20 or 30 bags at a time, restoration success is relatively low because you're not having a significant enough effect on the environment. Whereas if you think big and if you think at scale, then survival goes up, growth rate goes up, and the benefits that you're going to get back, the ecosystem services we derive, are improved significantly. And all that we're looking to do here is essentially shift the system. If you can imagine planting 20 bags in a bay, it's not going to have a huge effect on that bay. But if you plant 1 million seeds and thousands of bags across a bay, and they all germinate and they all produce a plant, that has a huge impact on the biology and the ecology of that bay. And so you're able to flip the system essentially from one like we see on the right here, where there's no seagrass, and you get sediment resuspension and essentially some negative feedback loops, to more towards this one on the left, where you get seagrass in the system, particles and nutrients are trapped in the sediment. You create a 3-dimensional habitat for fish and other invertebrate species, and you get sediment oxygenation. So essentially, we're looking to flip the system from B over here to A. Now, the methods we use at the moment, we often refer to as underwater gardening because, as I said, 2 hectares, whilst we're pleased that we're able to achieve that scale, to get to 2,500 hectares, we're going to have to think about how we can improve our methods. And, conversations like I'm having now, reaching out to people who've got expertise in other areas is I think, how we're going to achieve that. As it stands, it's a method which is collection of seeds by hand. You can see a diver here on the left. It could be done by snorkeling, it could be done by wading at low tide. And all you're looking to do is essentially collect the seeds. Now, the seeds are found in these little pods, and you can see in each pod there might be 7 or 8 seeds. And essentially all we're looking to do is not damage the plant in any way other than to snap the seeds out when they're ripe, and we take those to the lab for processing. So one of the reasons why they've all been brought back to the lab for the Dale project is because we were collecting seeds from the Channel Islands, Isle of Man, Wales, England, and all taking them to the lab in Swansea. And for biosecurity purposes, they needed to basically, we need to make sure they were sterilised before they were put out. That process is pretty smelly, and it's pretty labour intensive. So the team in the labs were essentially sieving out the seeds. The seeds are negatively buoyant, so they tend to drop out. And all you're looking really to do here is mimic nature. So the plant material and the seeds are allowed to bubble around, to be stirred around in tanks. And essentially the plant material rots down on the outside, the case, and the seeds will fall out to the bottom where they're collected. We then pack those seeds in these little Hessian bags. We plant 50 seeds into a Hessian bag. And the reason why we put 50 seeds in is because actually germination rate can be very low. from every bag, we might only get, well, on average, might get about 5 shoots, 3 to 5 shoots, but germination rate in some cases can be as low as 5%. But by putting 50 seeds in every bag, we're guaranteeing that we're at least going to get 1 germination from each of those bags. And that's the key thing. We then attach these Hessian bags to ropes, and we lay those ropes out on the seabed. And that's done by, again, by hand. This is the team in 2019 lowering those bags over a rib. And if you can imagine, 2 hectares, essentially 2 football pitches or 2 rugby pitches, depending upon your sport. And essentially we're just zigzagging over our target area and deploying those bags on the seabed. Then what we do is we'll go, they'll be deployed in, the picking happens in the August, the planting happens in the October, and in the following spring, we'll go back and we'll see if, and we'll look at basically do some surveying and monitoring to see germination success. So here you can see a diver from this individual bag, the ropes running north-south there. From this individual bag, I think we've had 1, 2, 3 successful germinations. There'll be a similar bag behind, and there'll be a similar bag just under Blaze's name outshot here. And so in an initial restoration, what you're actually seeing is just individual plants or clusters of plants growing. What we all know, though, is seagrass grows rhizomatically. And so over the next few seasons, from the original plant, a plant will pop up beside it, just a few centimetres away, 10 centimetres away or 5 centimetres away. And then another plant will do that next season, and so on and so forth. So over time, what is a series of individual plants or clusters of plants on the seabed will grow together to form the seagrass meadow you can kind of envisage in your mind. That process, like I said, is kind of for me, it's an underwater gardening process, and it's super because you get mass participation. We've had school groups packing seed bags for us. We've had in old people's homes, we've had seagrass workshops. It's been a real way of engaging with the community and engaging with people and exploring seagrass and running workshops and improving ocean literacy. But 2 hectares isn't going to change the outcome when we consider we've lost 30, 40, perhaps even 50 kilometres squared of seagrass around the UK. So how can we scale up? Well, we're looking to our experts overseas, perhaps where restoration has been a bit more of a cultural norm for a while now. The Australians have had a long history of seagrass research, excellent seagrass research, and so there's a lot of inspiration we take from the research groups over in Australia, especially along the Great Barrier Reef. But whilst it's useful to look to those groups to see how they've been restoring, there's also a lot that we can learn from the USA, and in particular Bob Orr's group at VIMS, because they're working with the same seagrass. So what Bob's group has achieved over in Chesapeake Bay is, over the past 20 years, they've managed to restore 3,612 hectares of Zoster marina. So if you think we've planted 2 hectares and we're looking to do 2,500 in 10 years, over the past 20 years, they've managed to achieve 36 kilometres square, so 3,612 hectares. So it is possible, but how did they do it? So one of the ways they've achieved this is by mechanising the process slightly. So the photo in the bottom shows the sort of mechanisation of the seed collection, and the top photo shows the Zoster marina being collected. But essentially, what they're doing is cutting at the very end of the season, when the seeds are ready to be cut, just before the seagrass dies back, actually collecting the seeds mechanically through this mean, and essentially just chopping off, coppicing almost the top of the meadow. That's one way that restoration has been achieved, because you can collect, rather than collecting 500,000 seeds a year, you can potentially collect 5 million seeds or more. And there's definitely ways I think we can work to improve this, learning both from Bob's group and also working with engineers here in the UK. And we've been very fortunate. The Welsh Government has supported us with the development of the building of a mechanisation boat to explore these options. Production. Maybe we don't need to pick at all. What Central Queensland University have done, and Dr. Emma Jackson's team there, is they've set up a seagrass nursery. So just like we have seagrass nurseries on land for forests, why not have a seagrass nursery here in the UK for seagrass restoration. If we want to restore forests at scale, we need seedlings and saplings, which we can then take to restore those terrestrial areas. And it's exactly the same concept for the sea. So maybe we don't need to interfere with existing seagrass meadows, but we can actually, we can support that seed collection by growing seeds in a nursery environment. The photo here is a concept from Alexander Crosdell. The one photo on the left here, it's a seed processing unit. Now, if we're going to have some community-led seagrass restoration here in Scotland, then rather than trying to mimic the sea on land via aquaria facilities, perhaps if we were restoring at small scale, we could just process the seeds in the sea and then go and collect them. So essentially put the seagrass pods you saw earlier into the buoy, and then let the sea do its work, let the pods rot down, let the seeds fall out to the bottom, and then go back and collect those seeds that way. Or we could adopt an Australian style approach where we have a seagrass nursery and we can scale up seed collection in that way as well. So it might not just be picking in the future, it might actually be the production of seeds in a more large scale process. And what about planting? So one of the techniques that's being explored in the Wadden Sea and that's being explored in Chesapeake Bay is the dragging of a sled along the seabed and injecting essentially seeds into the sea floor. This concept has been picked up by Rob Ocean, a mechanical engineering group at Edinburgh University, and they've been designing an underwater robot that could essentially crawl along the seafloor and inject seeds into the seafloor that way. Or it could even be done, I guess, initially on the intertidal if there are issues around waterproofing. So I think fundamentally innovation is going to be key here, and I think this is an opportunity for Scotland because we've got a very collaborative research community. We're a centre of excellence really in marine science, and the very fact that MASTS exists here is for me a huge asset because it enables conversations like the one I'm having now, and an opportunity for us to reach out. And fundamentally, geographically, we're a small nation, so there's always the opportunity to come together to sort of bounce ideas around and to see how we can collaborate. So what else is happening in Scotland? So linked to this is the fact that we've got excellence outside of the traditional academic circles and this willingness to collaborate. I've been working with the Royal Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh and Nature Scott on a genetics connectivity project. Fundamentally, before we start moving seagrass seeds around Scotland, we want to understand what's the genetic diversity like in Scotland. Are all beds the same, or is there a pattern to their distribution? And so that works is currently being continued now. So we ran an initial round of the project, the initial sites there on the right hand side, and that was run from October to December last year. But because of the results that we achieved and because of interest from outside Scotland now on that project, we've actually opened it up for another few months from March, April, May this year, where samples are being submitted to the botanics from Ireland, England, Wales, the Channel Islands, across the UK. And so that'll actually provide a really nice context for the genetic connectivity, not just of Scottish seagrasses, but where they fit into the big picture in terms of the wider UK. And in fact, indeed, the Nordics and potentially the east coast of America as well. I think within Scotland, we've also got a very rich database. Marine Scotland have got, for any of you, I imagine will be familiar with this, the National Marine Plan Interactive. So I've used this tool extensively for site selection, for taking samples for genetic analysis. But having that as a resource and having those kind of resources available makes planning and coordination of science and research much easier, and puts us in a very fortunate position compared to other nations that I've worked with globally. We've also got sort of crowdsourced, motivated community contributions. So the National Biodiversity Atlas, the NBN Atlas, that's quite a useful tool for. This is a map of where Zoster marina has been spotted. And so whilst not as nowhere near as accurate as the NMPI, it is a good indicator potentially of areas where seagrass might have been spotted. And then also at Project Seagrass, we've got Seagrass Spotter, which is our citizen science platform. That's only been global for about 5 or 6 years now. And so any of the sightings on there are recent sightings. And therefore, if you were to return to those spots, you can be pretty confident that the seagrass that's been spotted will still be there. So that will help inform our mapping projects going forward. And I think that's, for me, one of the big elements is understanding what we've already got in Scotland. So restoration is a tool, but restoration fundamentally is much more expensive than prevention is best than cure. So I'd much rather prevent the loss of seagrass meadows and actually understand where they are to start with than have to resort to restoration. If we're resorting to restoration, it's because we've already gone too far. And so for estuaries like the Firth of Forth and the Clyde, you know, there's a well-documented decline there in those estuaries, but there's also a huge opportunity to bring those back. And so judicious and well-considered restoration projects there, I think, could have a huge effect on those water bodies, positive effect over the next 10 years. But I think the other element here is actually understanding what resource we have. And so there's the real strength of Scotland here is the technology and the resources that we have available to do this. Remote sensing broadly refers to acquisition of information without being in physical contact with it. Where we're working with this is with satellites, so Landsat and Sentinel data, but also using drone technology. The remote sensing technology has increased or improved significantly in the past 10 years. And I just want to give you a quick overview of how we've used remote sensing technology to map seagrass meadows globally, but also how they can be used here in Scotland too. So back in 2013, 2014, when I was doing my PhD, this was one of the newest drones on the market at the point. It's a Phantom, and we use that drone. There's a photo here on the bottom. You can see by taking a photo straight down, you can get a spectral signature returned, which might be indicative of what the habitat is. There's no way of knowing what that image is showing you unless you actually get in the water to have a look, and we call that ground truthing. But for me, I'd spent time in the water measuring the heights of the blades of the seagrass and looking at the different habitat types. And so I was able to train essentially by taking photos from above and actually having been in the water, I was able to train the computer to identify which habitats are seagrass, which habitats are sand, and which habitats are rocky algae. And this is a growing area of research is using computers to identify from images that we create, whether that's underwater camera images or whether that's remotely sensed images like these, to be able to identify what it is that those images are showing us. The image in the top right here is from North Wales. It's an intertidal seagrass meadow, and quite clearly you can see the extent of the seagrass and then the bare sediment surrounding it. And so again, going back to this idea of Scotland being highly collaborative, and also Scotland wanting to support excellent marine research, we've been very fortunate to be working with and to be supported by Marine Scotland in our remote sensing activities, and we've got 2 case studies running this year. So one is in Orkney, and there's a bay in Orkney, St. Peter's Bay, where if you look at the Marine Scotland NMPI, there's lots of point data to say that there's Zoster marina under these points, but there's no indicator there of actually what's the extent of those beds. By flying a drone over this area, we'll be able to turn that point data into polygon data. So instead of saying we know there is seagrass under these points, and I think for it to be included in the NMPI, it needs to be a feature, so 5 meters by 5 meters. Hopefully, we'll be able to come back with an exact figure and say we have 375 meters squared of seagrass in this area. So essentially, what we're looking to try and do is to turn point data into polygon data. And so I think we'll all appreciate that if we have an understanding of the total extent of seagrass, that's much more valuable to us as resource managers and marine scientists, rather than just an indication that the species exists under that GPS location. And equally, the case study site is Loch Craignish in Argyll. The local community has been out and used Seagrass Spotter to pinpoint, to ground truth this dark patch, which gives me confidence based upon the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 photos there that is indeed seagrass. And so we can continue to fly over that bay, and they've also done it elsewhere in the loch. And then from the photo that we create, the orthomosaic we create, we can then establish how much seagrass is in that bay as well. So that's essentially done through this process called orthomosaic creation, and it's essentially stitching together lots of photos that are overlapped, and that creates essentially one huge photo, which gives us a very high resolution picture of what is under of what we're looking at. An example of here from the Philippines. There's a nice website there. I'd encourage you to have a look yourself, but we've all been on Google Earth, and we can see from space, you zoom in and then you begin to lose the resolution and the clarity. Whereas if you do that, if you can put your orthomosaic over the top, you can zoom in to a very, very high resolution. And so you can get a lot of detail out of the photos that might not be achievable from satellite imaging. So what drone and why? So I say Marine Scotland have been very supportive, and also the Welsh Government have been very supportive of this mapping work. Entry-level drones, whilst they're great and they're exceptional tools for communication, can't cover the area that you need when you're doing a professional survey job. And so by having a bespoke high-end surveying drone, you're able to cover a much larger area over a shorter period of time. And fundamentally, when we're working at a national scale, like looking at Scotland, we need a drone that can be in the air for long periods of time and cover huge areas. So we've got a project Seagrass now, we've got 2 Wingtra 1s, and as you can see here, on a single flight, they might be able to cover 110 hectares, whereas a DJI Phantom 4 might only cover 8 hectares, and so you'd have to fly that several times just to equate to one flight of a Wingtra. And again, if you were to fly that Wingtra at its maximum height on a perfect day, I think it can fly for around 55 minutes. And I think it can cover 400 hectares on a single flight. So when you're working at national scales, it's those kind of surveying tools that we have access to in Scotland and are going to make a huge difference. There's also we're very fortunate to have access to the resources in terms of the technology. So the camera on the Wingtra 1 can have absolute accuracy down to 1 centimetre. And essentially what we'll be looking to do is fly the Wingtra 1 so that every pixel you see on the screen is equivalent to 1 centimetre in real life. So you can be confident that every colour that you get back from the image you create will be able to pick out whether it's seagrass or sand or rocky algal, as it will give us very high resolution and detailed maps. But there's also the development of multispectral sensor technology, in particular Red Edge, which is used extensively at the moment in the terrestrial context for looking at plant health, but that could also be transferred, some of those concepts into looking at seagrass health in the marine environment. So I guess that's a bit of an overview of everything that we're looking at in Scotland, from genetics to remote sensing to restoration. But fundamentally, all of those workflows come together, and they come together in and around science and technology. So yeah, I just want to say thank you all in the MASTS community for listening to me today. We're hoping to bring together the seagrass community in Scotland later this year, COVID depending, for a seagrass restoration conference or a seagrass session at the MASTS annual science meeting. But fundamentally, for me, like I said at the beginning, it's about collaboration, it's about reaching out, it's about working together and seeing how we as a community can best work towards these 2 decades and Agenda 2030. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Richard, for that really excellent talk. Amazing images and great demonstration of research happening right now. And I'm glad to see that you're able to actually get out and do some field work in last year's autumn, when we had restrictions that were slightly lighter than normal.
Small windows.
Yeah, jump on those opportunities.
It wasn't warm.
It wasn't warm, no, I bet it wasn't. We're going to work through the questions that have been submitted by our attendees. So if anyone who is with us wants to submit a question because you haven't typed it already, then please click that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and submit a question there. You can see what everyone else has asked as well. And if you're joining us on YouTube, please just use the live chat to submit a question. And if you want to have a bit more of a direct conversation with Richard, then you can see on the screen his email address and also social media accounts. And if you want to follow Project Seagrass, they are literally on every single social media platform that you can imagine, so you can check them out there as well. But we're going to go straight to the Q&A that we have here, and I think actually it might be more useful to go to the second question that's in the list, Richard, which is asking what were the most significant reasons and mechanisms that caused loss in the UK? I assume this person is meaning, is it just water quality? Was dredging ever a factor that might have happened? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think water quality it would probably be one of the major stresses, but I think fundamentally there'll have been a number of multiple stresses which will cause seagrass loss. So the loss of seagrass can often be site specific. And whether that is due to too much nutrient loading in a particular location over a period of time, whether that's like physical, mechanical damage. We're seeing, there's small patch damage where you might have a mooring system in place which perhaps isn't sensitive to the benthic habitat. So often we see if you've got a mooring system where there's like a chain followed by rope, then you get this dragging effect where halos are created in the seagrass bed. And that's just a traditional mooring system. But advanced mooring systems do exist now, which are actually stronger than the traditional mooring systems. And so it's about slowly, as technology improves and as we become aware of these issues, just slowly adapting our practices to making sure that we're not having that effect on seagrass. But yeah, broadly speaking, I'll say water quality historically has been one of the big drivers, and anecdotally, there's a huge loss of seagrass in the 1930s due to a seagrass wasting disease. But I would imagine that wasting disease was able to take hold because the seagrass was under stress from poor water quality issues. So
yeah. Okay, that leads us quite nicely on to the second question, which is actually at the top of our list, from Belle, asking if water quality is one of the issues for seagrass meadows within estuaries, would there be scope to couple seagrass restoration with native oyster restoration projects?
Absolutely, yeah. So I'm sitting here as Chief Executive Project Seagrass, but I think fundamentally I'm a ecologist, and it's not just about seagrass restoration, it's about seascape restoration. I think I made that point in the talk, but we need to be considering habitat connectivity. We need to be considering the positive feedback mechanisms that exist when you bring bivalves together with seagrass ecosystems and other habitat types as well. So for us, it's we've chosen to specialize in seagrass and to blow the trumpet, I guess, for seagrass, but we're all acutely aware that nature doesn't work in isolation, and seagrass doesn't work in isolation. So 2 hectares of seagrass in Dale, whilst is a great achievement, really it's the beginning of it's just to showcase that seagrass restoration can happen. And aspirationally, we want to work with the MASTS community and the global community to find out the best way of returning seascapes back to healthy and productive states.
Absolutely. And that links nicely to the next question from Suze, asking where has the 2,500 hectare target for restoration come from? So I think that related to the graph that you showed earlier, showing that if it's too small, it's not really successful, but you don't want to overwhelm the area either. It's
also, so that the UK target there, it's very difficult to compare Chesapeake Bay with the UK. And so in some of the methods that we've developed in terms of our Hessian bag method for restoration here, had to really be adapted from. We had to come up with some bespoke methods really, because we essentially in the southwest we get these huge tidal ranges, and so there's lots of water movement, and so we can't just broadcast seeds over the side of the boat, because in the Bristol Channel, they'd be halfway out into the Atlantic by the time they hit the seafloor. So we had to come up with some methods which were, I guess, unique for the UK. And there's also, and we've all been to, I think, well, hopefully, we're aware of the west coast of the UK. It can be a pretty dynamic environment in places. And so where seagrass meadows exist, they tend to be, I guess, a little bit more in areas where there's clear shelter rather than the big lagoon that is Chesapeake Bay. So you can't really compare like for like. The 2,500 hectare target is an aspirational one, and it's an aspirational one because based upon the research that has been conducted over the past few years, we may have lost 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 hectares of seagrass. We could say we'd love to restore 5,000 hectares of seagrass by 2030, but I think we needed to be realistic, and we need to be realistic on what's gone before. If the team in Chesapeake Bay have been able to restore 3,600, so 3,612 hectares in 20 years, then 2,500 hectares in 10 years, I think is doable, or we think is doable, because it's not a ridiculous target. It's a target which is aspirational but manageable, if that makes sense. And also, there's going to be a need for that, but that's also not about us restoring it as individuals. This is about stimulating, I guess, the appetite for restoration, the culture of restoration. This, looking at the UN decade here, hashtag generation restoration. If you have a look on that on Twitter or Instagram or any other social media platforms, it's quite inspiring because there's community groups across the planet and institutions across the planet that are really pushing this idea that restoration is possible. And so for us, what hopefully Dale has shown is that it is possible. And what I would love to take hold in Scotland is this real can-do attitude that generation restoration is here, it's in Scotland, and that everyone on this call and in the wider community globally who are listening want to contribute to this vision of a healthy and productive marine environment. So it's I guess fundamentally it's an achievable target, but it's based on the fact that we've probably lost 5,000 hectares, and so 2,500 hectares by 2030 would be a pretty good return, considering we've only got 9 years left.
Mm-hmm. And thinking about that, the 2,500 is the target. This relates to the next question from Ethan, saying what metrics are being used or will be used to assess the success of the seagrass restoration projects? Is it just the number of hectares that you're going to try and restore? Is there anything else that could be added in?
So it's quite difficult to. So yes, I mean, fundamentally you can go to hectares and say, okay, we've because once you've kickstarted the system, so in terms of putting 2 hectares back in Dale, that seagrass meadow, once it's taken hold, might well then continue to expand, and we see this with Chesapeake Bay. I think they've only planted. I need to go back and have a look at the paper. But let's say they've planted 20 million seeds, or maybe 60 million seeds. But they've managed. What's happened is once the seagrass meadow, it's become a positive feedback loop. Once the seagrass meadow has taken hold, it has then expanded. So they haven't actually had to plant 3,612 hectares. I think they might have only planted, let's say, 600 hectares. But once the system's kicked back, it's expanded, and you're getting all the benefits. Nature's taking care of itself. So all they've done is they give it the kickstart it needs. Defining a seagrass meadow is actually something which is quite challenging to do, because depending upon where you find a seagrass meadow, whether it's high up on the intertidal or whether it's in subtidal in a loch, you might find that the shoot density is very different. You might find actually physically the canopy height is very different. And so at what point we define a seagrass meadow is quite a challenging. I mean, who decides basically? Who decides that's a seagrass meadow and that's not a seagrass meadow? And also define a hectare. Like ideally, you'd want to have a seagrass to get the best out of the best ecosystem service gains back. You want the seagrass meadow to be lush and to be thick and to be sequestering all that carbon and to providing that complex three-dimensional habitat. When we first put the seagrass back, that's not what it looks like. It's a small cluster of plants, a gap, a small cluster of plants, a gap. Now at that point, for me, that's not a seagrass meadow. That's the early stages of restoration. But that's equivalent to what we see on land when we restore forests. If you put a sapling in and a sapling in and a sapling in, at that point, it's not a forest. It's not full of vibrancy and life. It takes 10 years for that to happen. And it's the same with restoration in the marine environment. So for me, yes, covering an area, which will then become a mature meadow, is key. But where we're really going to see the benefits is the quality of the habitat that's produced after 10 years or after 20 years or however long it takes for that meadow to reach its maturity. So, yeah, I guess you can go purely from a geographical extent perspective, but that's not telling the whole story. And I think that comes back to a point which I made earlier. Prevention is always better than cure. There's no point in losing mature meadows and then replacing them with immature meadows, because that's like cutting down an old growth forest and then replacing it with a new plantation. You're not going to see the benefits of that new plantation for years to come. But where we've lost it, let's get started, let's get planting. And then hopefully my daughter and, hopefully in a few years' time, but, next generation can see and reap the benefits of a healthy marine ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good ethos for that. And I'm just conscious of time, so I just want to highlight to anyone, if you submit a question but you have to scoot off for another meeting or whatever, this entire session is being recorded, so you'll be able to catch up on anything that you miss on the MASTS YouTube channel. And we're going to work through the rest of these questions with the time that we have. So stick with us if you can, and hopefully you'll hear the answer to your question, or just still engage with the conversation. So we're going to move on to the next question from Annie, which was asking, what is the medium you use in the Hessian bags for the seeds? Is it just the seeds in the little bags and off they go? Is that just it?
So it's sand. So it's inert sand. So seagrass grows in a variety of sediment types. So it can go from quite silty sediment to almost quite gravelly. We use a fairly sort of medium grain sand, inert sand. And again, that's a biosecurity decision we made for the first project, and actually that's an area which needs further exploration, really, because within the seagrass meadow, or within any water body, there's a huge microbiota which might be having a very important part to play in terms of the successful germination of those seeds. So one of the treatments I think we're going to be looking at going forward is actually, if you were to plant a seagrass meadow with some of the organic material from an original seagrass meadow, is that going to enhance germination? I think as an organisation, we have adopted a very precautionary principle in terms of making sure that we learn as we go along, and we learn from other colleagues. There's some outstanding seagrass science being done in Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands, France, Australia, States, and so every 2 years we try and get together to talk about and share learnings. But there's also probably learning that we can take from other individuals here in Scotland who are doing work on other plants or other species, and they face similar problems there, and there's probably some cross-pollination that can take place. So yeah, essentially all it is a Hessian bag, some inert sand, and some seeds. So 50 seeds in each bag, inert sand, Hessian bag. And the Hessian bag protects the seeds from predation from things like crabs, and it's also biodegradable. So once the roots have grown through and into the sediment and bound into the sediment, and the blades can grow up towards the sun, as it rots away, it's allowed it to sort of establish itself on the seabed.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Bernadette. There's a couple of questions in what she submitted. And the first one is, if historical data on seagrass coverage is difficult to obtain or pretty much non-existent, how can you assess that this habitat has been lost or degraded by 50 or even up to 90%? She then goes on to ask, also, why would advocating for governments to provide leadership in the phase 3 of the strategic plan from 2026 to 2030, surely you would need to engage the government at a very early stage before and during the restoration projects being undertaken in order to ensure compliance with current regulations. How is this engagement with government currently being done? So
yeah, no, absolutely. So yeah, two elements there, the 50 to 90%. So obviously there's an inherent in that data. When you look back in time, this is the issue, one of the challenges of this historical ecology. it's very difficult to get quantitative scientific data in the same way that we would understand that today. And so there is in that model, it's inherently vague. So I'd encourage you to go and have a look at Alex Green's paper there. But essentially what she's it's a best effort. So based upon where there is existing data available, and for both historically and today, we can then get a pretty solid idea of the extent of seagrass loss, which gives you that sort of 50% figure, somewhere between 40 and 50%. But based upon that trajectory and that profile, and if you were to extrapolate that across the UK, you can then go, well, actually, it's very likely that it used to exist here, and it no longer does, if that makes sense. So for the exact methods, so it's not my work, it's Alex Green's work. I'd suggest it's a Frontiers paper, so it's open access. Alex Green, Dr. Alex Green, sorry, as she is now. I'd encourage you to go and have a look at that paper. And then absolutely, from the start, it's about working with governments and working with regulators and working with and collaboration. So going back to Scotland, and I think this is a huge opportunity for Scotland. You know, I've been amazed since I've been here how collaborative the sort of general ethos is in Scotland. I think MASTS is a huge asset to that. But you know, working with Marine Scotland and Nature Scot, who very supportive of the work that we're trying to do, and fundamentally, it's about working with, and also from Scottish Government perspective, Gail Ross MSP is a species champion for Seagrass Meadows, and she's been a wonderful support and voice for seagrass in Scotland. And I think it's the community element of it. You know, fundamentally, we all understand there are multiple challenges to be had, multiple challenges out there for successful marine management in Scotland. We're a coastal nation with a huge extent of sea, and also we don't necessarily always have the resources to successfully manage that huge area. And so the only way that we can really meet some of those challenges is by identifying where the research gaps are, where the management gaps are, and doing what we can to work together to fill those, basically. So it's not going to be perfect, but I think it's a philosophy or state of mind up here that's how we're going to meet some of these big challenges.
Mm-hmm.
If that answers
Thank you.
Yeah.
So our next question is asking, have you discussed approaches to harvesting with the agricultural equipment designer industry?
Yeah, absolutely. Because we're not experts. So what we've done is we've spoken with the team in Chesapeake Bay. I say the Chesapeake Bay team are obviously 20 years ahead of us in terms of their journey, but they also know they don't have all the answers. And there's excellent research groups in particularly the Netherlands and Sweden, I'd say, who are looking at different ways of using engineering solutions to potentially improve harvesting technique and also improve planting technique. We've just entered into a collaborative project with CFAS and some of the water industry companies down south, Affinity Water and Anglian Water, looking at potentially ways that we could be innovative around the use of, let's say, dredge spoil. So when a harbour's dredged and that sediment is deposited, could that be deposited in a way which actually created habitat, which made a site ready-made for oyster spat deployment or seagrass meadow creation? And so, yes, 100%. Fundamentally, I'm sitting here as a biologist, and it's about reaching out to those experts. And so, going back to collaboration, that's partnerships. That's how we're going to achieve these goals.
Absolutely, we love a bit of cross-disciplinary collaboration, finding out stuff from other industries and other minds as well. So next question is from Lily, and they are asking, how do you establish which areas you're going to restore for seagrass? So what leads you to that decision?
So we're at Swansea University, the team there have got a predictive habitat model. So when you're looking to see where seagrass potentially could live around the coasts, you need to take into consideration the ecological condition. So that could be things such as exposure, so exposure to wave energy, tidal range. It could also be sediment type, and so the model will consider, based on a variety of factors. Essentially, on a map, it will go, this is a hotspot where seagrass could exist. And often that will overlap with where seagrass already does exist, but there'll also be areas where seagrass used to exist, which will come up on the model, but seagrass is no longer there because it's been lost because of water quality or whatever. So the ecological element of the predictive habitat model is pretty crucial. But I think there's also a social layer, which we're incorporating into that model now, which is what areas around the UK are receptive to the idea of restoration. Because this might sound counterintuitive or might feel counterintuitive, but some coastal areas or so-called coastal communities are against, or are maybe not against, perhaps nervous of restoration in their local area. You know, why do we need to restore it here? You know, in my lifetime it was never there, so why should it be there now? It's this kind of shifting baselines element, and I think this is actually, I've not really experienced this in Scotland, and I actually think in Scotland there's a quite extensive coastal communities network. There's a very proactive coastal community, number of coastal communities in Scotland who are keen not just on monitoring, but actually increasingly interested in restoring marine habitats. But understanding that complexity, and there might be, you know, if you're a yacht owner, or if you're I don't know, if you're using the marine environment for some reason, and you think that your use of that marine environment is going to be threatened by restoration, even if it's just temporarily, you know, even if it's just over a period of time, whilst X, Y, and Z happens, you're going to lose access to that area, then understandably, you're going to have concerns over these projects taking place. So it's inherently complex, but there's the predictive model for the ecology, but increasingly, and actually probably more importantly, from a sustainability perspective and a stewardship of the marine environment, it's about engaging with people and saying, this is why restoration is important. This is why we're looking at this particular area, and then walking through those concerns and exploring those concerns from a place-based perspective. Like, why is it that some areas are really keen on the idea of restoration and some areas are more against the idea? Quite complex and loaded, I guess.
Absolutely. We're going to go on to the question that is asking, any ideas on why germination rate is so low?
So I'm not an expert in this at all, but essentially could be down to that microbiota we spoke about. So is there an interaction between the microorganisms that we find in seagrass meadows, which which will have an influence on the successful germination or not? Is it something to do with the treatment and the hormones that are required to stimulate germination? This is an area which I think could have a huge bearing on future restoration success, and really this is where research institutions up here and elsewhere in the UK could run a series of treatments and trials to look at how can we increase germination success. Because if, let's say, 5 out of every 50 seeds germinate on average, and you can double that to 10 out of every 50, you can double the size of the area you can restore overnight. And then again, if you can get that from 5 to 20, quadruple. And so it's about that slow incremental research and those marginal gains that we can get in understanding the biology of the plant. I think that's, yeah, as I say, there's several reasons. That's not my area of expertise, so I'll leave that to the Dutch team to come up with the answer to that one. But it's definitely an area which could have a huge bearing on future restoration success.
All right, understood. We're going to move on to Irene's question. She submitted 2, so we're going to go with the first one. First up, so Irene is asking, are all UK seagrass meadows in the Crown Estate? So
no, is a short answer. Whilst the Crown Estate owns a lot of the seabeds, because seagrass is found both on the subtidal and on the intertidal, some of it is on privately owned land. And so again, that's a conversation which is very much place-based. So in areas we work in Wales, some of it's on some seagrass can be found on National Trust land, some can be found on private estates. And so because it sits on that sort of land-sea interface, both subtidally and intertidally, you tend to find there's some quite complex management or ownership arrangements over who owns seagrass meadows.
Irene's next question was, what can be done to enhance the physical environment of existing seagrass meadows to encourage populations? So assuming water quality improvement is quite an important one.
Yep. So what can be done to enhance physical environment of existing seagrass meadows? So one of the things that's been considered in Sweden at the moment by the Zorro group is they've actually deposited something, I think over like 1,000 tons of sand. They're changing the sediment type from what has become an algal dominated system to creating basically a blank canvas for seagrass. So actually, by changing the sediment type, they're hoping that that will enhance restoration success, and they're doing a trial of that on the west coast. So changing the physical parameters to make them more optimal for seagrass is one way of doing that. But yeah, fundamentally, what it comes down to is water quality. There are areas, I guess, globally where we see high degrees of nutrient loading and siltation, which might have an impact on the sort of the physical extent to where seagrass meadows can grow. But often, going back to the take-home message here, prevention is better than cure. So if we can start relieving some of the pressures, we often find that seagrass meadows are quite adaptive and they can recover. So first and foremost, let's relieve some of those pressures.
So Matt's question, which is the next one, asks, successful restoration will presumably need management measures to ensure the pressures that caused the loss in the first place are removed in the future. How will these projects interact with marine plans, for instance?
Yeah, absolutely. So to give you an example, in Dale, where the meadow's been restored, it's about the community engagement element first and foremost. So we all know that a management plan is only as good as it is enforced, and one of the ways of getting good enforcement is by engaging with people, because people are going to fundamentally choose what they do and the actions they take. So in an ideal world, we'd have had longer to engage with the people in Pembrokeshire and to the pace of that project, I think, was faster than we ideally would have liked, but we have to work with the timeframes available. But it's about that ongoing relationship and stewardship and open communication and having discussions with people who are using the area about what they use the area for, and where there could be potential areas of conflicts, but where there could be potential areas of opportunity. So we're working with a fisherman down there now who has actually just registered as our sensitive ecosystem responsible fisher award. So it's the first one we've launched, but essentially there's an agreement there that the fishing that's done is not going to have an impact on sensitive marine ecosystems. So whether that be seagrass or oyster reefs or mussel beds, and being a sensitive ecosystem, being a surf fisher, will hopefully will be an indicator to the market that as an individual, he's actually passionate about his fishery, about the environment in which he derives his income from, and so there's probably work that can be done there. Like I say, it's a pilot project. It's not by any means a finished article, but what it comes down to is how can we collaboratively work with those people who already work in the area and find a way which is beneficial for everyone. And if that's something that can be achieved, then that's the route we try and take.
So collaboration and communication, very important for this work. Our next question asks, what do you think about mangroves support growth in seagrass meadows? So some more of your international work.
Yeah, so in the tropical seascape, mangroves, seagrass meadows, coral reef, that trinity of habitat types are hugely connected. So what we see is if we remove mangroves and then you just look at the seagrass and the coral reefs, so that there are certain species of fish that just don't turn up on the coral reef as adults because they haven't had the nursery environment they've needed as juveniles. And so mangroves represent an enormous nursery habitat for a number of commercially important and biologically important fish species. And so what it is really is that continuum. Where you find mangroves, you find all the benefits that mangroves create in terms of sediment stabilization, protecting the shoreline, wave buffering, and that actually enhances then, in front of that, the conditions often for seagrass meadow growth. But that's also, there's an interplay there with the reef crest and intact and healthy coral reefs. So one of the things that we're advocating for is, in the tropics, often marine protected areas have been sort of ring fenced around a coral reef. That's like, here's a coral reef, we're going to protect the coral reef, and you draw a line on the map around a coral reef. But that's not protecting the coral reef, because and it's not protecting the coral reef fishery, because it's about the connectivity there. It's about the mangrove supply of species to the coral reef. It's about the seagrass meadow supply. And so what we need to be thinking about is that whole seascape, go back to seascape, and the connectivity of habitats within a seascape, which is what is provisioning for us. And so MPAs need to, in the same way that we shouldn't just put an MPA around a seagrass meadow here, MPAs need to cover that diversity of habitats. It's exactly the same in the tropics.
Mm-hmm. So just regarding that very last, the second to last sentence, I think you just said, Adrian's question is, are these habitats afforded protection as qualifying features in statutory designated sites for the UK?
So in Scotland, seagrass is a priority marine feature. So yes. However, it's very difficult to, if we don't know where seagrass is, it's very, very hard to protect it. And so, going back to the Marine Scotland drone work and that collaboration, that's a key part of being able to protect seagrass meadows going forward. And actually, for me, that collaboration and working with Marine Scotland on that is a really nice example of how we can bring together communities. So that work, we're doing those 2 case study sites, one in Orkney and one in Loch Craignish. There's a community in Loch Craignish, Cromac, who have been out into the loch, and they've been doing a lot of mapping, and so they've been GPSing using Seagrass Spotter the seagrass meadows within the bay. And so that's essentially doing the ground truth element for me, and then I can go across with the drone then, and then I can create the map, and I know which areas are seagrass and which areas aren't. And then in Orkney, I'm actually working with a commercial scallop diver. So he hand dives scallops and whelks. So it's a non-destructive form of fishing. He's got an outstanding local ecological knowledge of the seabed, because that's where he spends his life diving. But he's also a recreational drone pilot. And so as part of this project, we're actually training him to use this drone, this wing to drone, and then together, myself and the fishermen are going to go out and he knows the area, and together we're going to help map those seagrass beds. So really, for me that's research working with the community, with the support of government, with the support of scientists to achieve a common goal, which is let's have a better understanding of where these nursery habitats are, because that will benefit both the fishery and the fishermen, but also from a management perspective, governments will know where these habitats are.
Mm-hmm. Great. And so we're going to move on to the next question, which is a bit more plant-based, from Graham, asking, and apologies for all the mispronunciation I'm about to do, is Zostera like terrestrial rhizomatous grasses such as Elizabeth reopens, where small pieces broken, cut off, can turn into new plants? I'm sorry, that question to me when I read it out didn't even make any sense. Over to you, Richard.
Yes. So one of the methods actually for which has been considered elsewhere in the world for seagrass restoration is transplanting. And so what you do find is if you can imagine, basically if a part of the seagrass breaks off from the rhizome and then it is able to recolonize or re-establish itself elsewhere, then I guess just like for people listening who might be familiar with spider plants or strawberries, same concept. You can take a spider plant and you can plant it and it will then grow again. It's exactly the same idea. So seagrass, from the original seagrass, you'll get this rhizomatic growth, and then another seagrass will pop up, and so on and so forth. If you were, like on land with spider plants, if you were to take a snip of if you were to snip off the spider plant and plant it in a new pot, then you get a new plant, and so on and so forth. And so you end up with hundreds of spider plants. It's the same idea for the marine environment. So yes. that definitely does work.
Excellent. So Louise now asks that they are interested to find out how you identify and define different levels of condition from a monitoring perspective to see if there was an improvement in condition over time.
Okay, so one of the easiest ways, so there's lots of things you can do in terms of, you can look at like, again, water quality, so nutrient loading, and there's various tests that you could do from a sort of biochemical perspective, water perspective, in terms of the nutrients found within the water column and also within the leaves of the plant. But on a sort of global perspective, there's an excellent citizen science program run out of James Cook University called Seagrass Watch, and I think it's been around since 1998. But we tend to use that as a fairly decent indicator to get an idea of the condition of a seagrass meadow. So as part of that pro forma, at seagrasswatch.org, I encourage you to have a look at it. As part of the pro forma there, you will look at with a quadrat, you could lay that over a seagrass bed, and you can look at species composition. So it's quite easy in the UK because it's either Zosteraman or Zostranot, or sometimes you have both. In Australia, you might have 7 different species within a quadrat, but and then you will look at the canopy height. So how tall is the seagrass growing? You'll look at the percentage cover. So is it growing densely? Is it not growing densely? And then you'll look at elements like epiphyte cover. So how much epiphyte is growing on the blades? How much algae? Because the algae can be quite a good indicator if there's too much nutrients in the water column or whatnot. So there's a number of factors that, if you follow the Seagrass Watch protocols, you can get quite a good snapshot, like quite a good early indicator of the extent of that meadow. And also just by looking at the meadow, if it's covered in if it's covered in algae, that's a pretty fair indicator that it's probably not happy. But what you'll tend to see is the idea behind that Seagrass Watch is that you do it seasonally. So we've been monitoring a meadow in North Wales now since 2015, and we used to do it quarterly. We're doing it at the moment every 6 months, but from that you can see the sort of the growth rates in the summer and how that then drops off over the winter. You can also see changes in nutrient loading from like golf course runoff or whatever may be affecting the meadow. So Seagrass Watch, I think, would be the first port of call, but obviously there are more scientific methods if you have the resources to really go into detail on a particular meadow.
Mm-hmm. All these questions are linking in very nicely. So the next question is from Adrian asking, are there plans to develop habitat distribution maps that you discussed, like the NMPI, similar to terrestrial HabMOS dataset, or does it remain an academic endeavor?
So I guess the building of the habitat suitability model is very much an academic endeavor. The outputs from that, though, I think we're all keen again to share. So the habitat suitability model is being produced by Swansea University. I know there are a number of others that are being produced by other academic institutions around the UK. But for what we have complete control over at Project Seagrass is, for example, Seagrass Spotter. And all the data on Seagrass Spotter is open access, totally downloadable. Please feel free just to contact me, or I can pop it on Twitter. Occasionally we do that, the CSV, and you can just download all the information. Going back to the big picture here, data is only useful if it's shared. And people have access to it, so we're keen as much as possible to share all the data that we have. I think there's also, though, to be fair, there's a need for the model to be right, or to be as close to right as it can be. So there's no point in putting out information if it's really, really crude and it's not a very good model. A model's only as good as the data that goes in. So if it's not useful yet, and it's not accurate, then it could actually probably do more harm than good by sharing it. So yes, but fundamentally, we're very keen to make anything like that accessible.
Excellent. So yeah, check out that Seagrass Spotter website. There is so much information on there. It's amazing where you've received observations from. We're now down to our last 3 questions. So if there's anyone in our audience right now who still hasn't submitted a question, just pop it in that Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We're moving on to Valentina's question. They are asking if there is an estimation of the effects of removing seeds from the meadow. Are you affecting the reproduction and the health of that source meadow?
Yep, so that was definitely something to be aware of. So the meadow that we've generally used as a sort of main seed source is in North Wales, in the Penllyn Asana SAC in Porthcawl Line. And so what we've done is we collected data on seed density. What we might find over from year to year is that there might be slightly different amounts of seeds being produced from meadow to meadow, and this might vary actually from meadow in North Wales to let's say one on Arran to one on the east coast in the Dornoch or whatever. But it's important to get, and I think this is a big issue around seagrass literacy for the UK more generally. We need to get an idea of how many seeds a meadow produces per metre squared, let's say, or per 10 metres squared. And then what is a number of how many seeds can we take from any given meadow? So on paper, and this is where there's a lack of familiarity, I guess, with seagrass. On paper, if I was to say, I would like to take 500,000 seeds from this meadow, immediately that number sounds absolutely enormous. And people are like, whoa, let's slow down there. That's way too many seeds to be taken from that meadow. But if you do the maths and you think, actually, there's probably billions of seeds in that meadow, then 500,000 doesn't sound like very much. So for some of the smaller projects where we might be looking to take 10,000 seeds or 20,000 seeds, the impact on that meadow is negligible. And I guess the context here is all we're trying to do is to maximize, when it comes down to it, all we're trying to do is to maximize the chance of successful germination for a seed. So if you go think back to that image of those seeds and those pods, naturally, some of those seeds will drop off and get eaten. Some of those seeds will drop off and wash out to sea on a current, or might find their way to a place where they're not necessarily going to have a successful germination. By us basically collecting them and sort of protecting them in little Hessian bags and planting them at exactly the right depth with the perfect conditions, all we're doing is maximising their chances of germination. And then to add to that, once we have that successful germination and that becomes a meadow, you're actually increasing the total amount of seeds available to you moving forward. And so one of the options we've been looking at is this idea of a seagrass nursery. And in that case, could we grow seagrass meadows in a marine environment on land where we can control those conditions, and then where we're not actually taking that many seeds from nature at all, because we can create the seeds that we need on land, and then it's just additional to what exists in nature. I think there'll always be an opportunity for seed collection in nature, because there's so many of them. But I think, fundamentally, I think having a nursery would also allow us to control, the genetics, the various elements to try and enhance the process and make it more effective.
Mm-hmm. Down to our last couple of questions. Guillaume asks, for more turbid water, have you considered exploring full waveform topographic LiDAR or underwater acoustic remote sensors?
So not within the group, we haven't. Although again, that sounds like a collaboration, doesn't it? So the turbid waters, from a remote sensing perspective, are one of the challenges. There's a researcher in Germany called Dimos Tragonos, and he's working with Google Earth Engine. And what he is specifically around the mapping of seagrass meadows. And so he started his work with case studies in East Africa and places where we got this high, and the Mediterranean, where there's high transparency. And mapping is obviously much easier than in turbid conditions. Training the Earth Engine and training the algorithms to deal with the complexities of turbidity is something that he's going to be facing, and that remote sensing group are facing. In terms of trying to get that remote sensing algorithm to work globally, and so that's probably where reaching out to those remote sensing teams would be very, very useful, because that sort of cross-pollination and cross-fertilization of ideas and expertise is where we're going to have those huge gains in terms of the outputs we need, which are maps of seagrass.
Just to remind everyone that Richard's contact details are on the screen. So if you're open to that idea of a collaboration, drop him a line. Our next question is very similar in thought. Valentina is asking, is bioturbation a threat? In the literature, bioturbation can severely affect seeds germinating. But actually, with the little sandbags, the Hessian bags that you've been working on, I guess that kind of helps secure them a bit more in the sand.
Yeah, Valentina, exactly. So 100% it's a threat, and there's evidence of that. Certainly, there's one Eduardo's paper from Sweden, I think, is one that springs to mind, but also elsewhere in the world. One of the reasons for the Hessian bag is to provide that protection, and we're not saying it's the only method. I think I'm looking forward to connecting after this long period of lockdown and COVID with the global community and find out exactly what everyone else is doing and what gains have been made over the past few years. We hosted an international seagrass biology workshop, which is I guess the workshop or conference where all the global seagrass community gets together back in Wales in 2016. So 5 years ago now, and that conference, there was a real decision and move based upon what is quite a small global community of seagrass researchers to explore restoration. I think we're seeing the fruits of that work now. But fundamentally, since then, and especially because the conference in Maryland was cancelled or postponed this year, and because of COVID and everything that's happened over the past few years, we haven't had the opportunity to catch up. And there has been so much development in all our teams working across Europe on this. I think the real opportunity is, like I said before, coming together as scientists in Glasgow at the MASTS ASM and seeing if we can learn from each other and learn about the successes, yes, but also learn about what hasn't worked and how we can share knowledge so we can make these things more effective moving forward. So yeah, Hessian bags do reduce that, and that's one of the reasons why they're included. But there's probably other ways that we can further reduce it as well.
Yeah, so spoiler alert for everyone who's still with us, there's a sneak preview to what will be in the MASTS Annual Science meeting later this year. We're going to have our last question now. They have asked, how sensitive would a seagrass habitat in Scotland be to coastal onshore quarry operations or developments like a wind farm?
Yeah, it depends how well that installation is done. That's a I guess case by case basis. It's like anything, if something's done well and it's done in a considered manner, and the process has been thought through, then impacts can be minimal. If it's done in a cavalier manner and it hasn't been thought through, then the impacts can be substantial. So it's I think we've got to avoid in science and avoid in our positions on things absolutes like blacks and whites, because there's never really a black and white answer. Inherently with a lot of this there's grey areas and there's ways that things can be improved and ways things that and there's routes through areas of potential conflict. So I'm just trying to think of an example where there might be a trade-off. But let's say hypothetically that we wanted to install a breakwater to allow a ferry to get to one of our islands in Scotland. That might impact the local marine environment. In fact, it almost certainly would. But there's probably offsetting that you could do there. There's probably ways that you could think about mitigating some of that effect if you were to do it in a considered manner. And in areas where you're absolutely going to cause some damage because you're going to put breakwater over it, then perhaps you can think about how you could improve the habitat or restore more broadly. I think there's no point in coming down and saying the breakwater absolutely can't be built, because for the communities who are living on the islands, that's a lifeline. They might need to get to the mainland for emergency hospitals, services, or whatever it may be. So you can't just come down and say that's not happening. And then equally, you can't say this is going in and it's going to go in, I'm going to put it in 3 days, and we don't really care about the ecosystems. So it's about saying, okay, how do we move forward on this and make sure that there's a positive outcome, or as positive an outcome as can be achieved for everybody.
Right, thank you, Richard. One last question has just snuck in, so we're going to try and answer that really quickly because I am so aware of the time that we have gone over, but that's just because we've had so many amazing questions. So Rachel's question is there any temperature impact on the balance between asexual and sexual reproduction as seen in male?
That sounds like a project to me as well. Not that, so Rachel, to my knowledge, there might be a seagrass expert out there who has that knowledge. I do not. It's definitely something worth considering. We, anecdotally, from my experience, and this is just my experience in the UK, we do tend to see the seeding, or first the flowering and then the seeds. There does appear to be a bit of a latitudinal gradient there. So in terms of when we've harvested seeds in the past, then like, let's say Cornwall, you might expect to see the peak seeds in like late July. In North Wales, it's usually the first couple of weeks of August, and that might be my expectation that Scotland would probably be a little bit behind that. So, but what we from doing that work with Nature Scott last November, there were meadows there where there was the odd bits of flowering and the odd bits of seeding, even that late in the season. So there's work to be done. I think fundamentally we're at the if we knew as much about seagrass as we did about, let's say, rice or wheat, I'd be able to answer these questions. But there's still a lot of unknown out there, and so I guess my final collaborative call is, guys, if you're interested in seagrass, please do get in touch, and I'd love to work with you to answer some of those questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Richard, for an amazing talk, but also plowing through so many questions with us today.
Pleasure.
Yeah, if anyone wants to find out more, use those contact details on the screen. The recording of this entire webinar is going to be on our MASTS YouTube channel later today. So if you want to share it with anyone or recap, or I don't know, put it in a lecture, then you are more than welcome to use that and check it out on the MASTS YouTube channel. Thank you very much, Richard, for being today's MASTS webinar presenter. Pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
For everyone who is still with us, I would just like to highlight what next week's talk is. So it's Christina Barclay. She is from the Canada's Ocean Acidification Community of Practice, and she's going to be talking all about their work and what they get up to. So you can find out more about them. We have talks throughout the rest of May as well. And June now. We had such popular demand for webinars that we have collaborated with EMBRC to provide some European-based talks for you. And also this, the month of June includes the 2 rescheduled talks that we were unable to bring you due to cancellations. So Douglas Spears and Tamara Galloway, they've been rescheduled for June. So if you signed up for these talks and obviously weren't able to attend because they had to be cancelled, then please check out the MASTS website to sign up for these. It is a different web page for the June talks than it was for today's talk. So check out the MASTS website to sign up for any of these talks happening in June. And obviously what we have coming up in May and next week too. So I hope we can see you again, and thank you for staying with us throughout this entire webinar.